So if you didn't realize it, this man is the most connected person in the world when it comes to entrepreneurship. And I want to pick up on some of the themes that you laid out here. Let's start with this whole concept of where entrepreneurship thrives. There is a myth that Silicon Valley is the model that everyone should follow. That's the hub of entrepreneurship. Why do you think entrepreneurship thrives in other places, and what kind of makes that possible?
Well, I think there's always going to be this element of passion and commitment, which we always hear this about entrepreneurs, but it is a lot easier to be a bigger fish in a smaller sea. One of the things that I hear from Valley entrepreneurs is, to some degree, it's hard to have an original how to do something differently, which is, of course, what entrepreneurs do. They birth the new, they figure out a better way of doing something. You're driving along in Nairobi and you see that, I don't know, I'm trying to think of, okay, here's an example. So you notice that 3 times out of 5, the power grid goes down, which means, the traffic lights go down, which means that it's hard to get from one side of Nairobi to the other, okay? So you're exposed to that kind of challenge. And of course, that one was fixed by someone coming up with a solar-powered set of traffic lights, as many of you know, that ended up, solving a traffic problem. But the point is that I think you can embed it anywhere, but you've got more necessity driving the energy to come up with new ideas. I certainly think that people spending some time in places like Silicon Valley are always helpful because you're going to build your networks. For the past 2 years, we've had a declining. We've seen fewer Indian Americans in America than we have in previous years, where there was always an influx of Indian American entrepreneurs. And I talked to some of them, and they were saying it's interesting because now I'm allowed to visit the United States, and I come over and I see my friends. The fact that I never got a visa to stay here and start my company doesn't matter anymore. I've started it in India. And actually, it's turning out fine because my costs are so low, but I've still got all my Valley network. So I don't want to dispute being able to cherry pick things that you find useful for the Valley. Maybe even in your community, you want to copy their paperwork that they, the city did in terms of coming up with a way to standardize first rounds of funding for investors, for example. So you can pick individual things in the Valley that you like. So, but I think at the end of the day, Steve Case, of course, calls it the rise of the rest. At the end of the day, there's no reason why you can't import those factors that you need into any city in the world.
And so you mentioned some of the factors that make a city thrive in entrepreneurship, whether it's the density, the diversity, those sorts of things. What are some cities that you've seen that are particularly strong in entrepreneurship?
Well, so certainly one of the things that you could look at in the United States, there is clearly a rise of some communities that no one really had previously thought of as being entrepreneurial hotspots. Places like Nashville, Albuquerque, Madison, Wisconsin, and you can certainly do that. I think the more interesting cases are the ones actually outside the United States. So some obvious examples where we've been monitoring, tracking what's going on. If you look in Africa, what's been going on in Accra and in Nairobi. And a lot of the time, what we're seeing in those communities is the import of individuals from other entrepreneurial hotspots. So they have brought in a little bit of a catalyst, rather like some of you may have had one of the speakers talk to you about Startup Chile. Does anybody had Startup Chile? Does anybody know what that is? Startup Chile is a program where the government of Chile actually pays $40,000, I think it's $50,000 now, to bring in a class of entrepreneurs. And I went with the first class like 6 years ago, and they imported the culture effectively, because in Santiago what they did is that you would have a guy that had been working for Google for 5 years, who was like, one of them was, and he said, I've always wanted to do a startup, but they wrote a check and said, you come live here, you start it here, we'll give you the check, okay? And by the way, we have awesome snowboarding in August. It's an awesome place to come and hang out and bring your founder team. So they ended up importing talent that came for various reasons, but ended up becoming rock stars. And when I was there and I went around with them, we'd go in the bar and the very first group of them, and it was so much fun because they were treated as rock stars. They're like, hey, those are the startup Chile guys, And so I think you can definitely see that in places like Santiago and so forth, where you've seen this wonderful circulation of talent that's come from other cities to be able to make that possible.
So entrepreneurship is thriving in different cities outside of the Valley. Is there a difference between the type of companies that are founded in Silicon Valley versus the companies that you see growing up elsewhere?
Yeah, so cities are definitely continuing on the path that economic development officials have always sort of advocated, which is to try to build on their strengths and have specializations. Of course, we now live in a world whereby, it used to be when I started my first company, if I wanted to go into advertising, I had to be in Madison Avenue. It mattered where you went if you wanted to start that company. I don't think that matters so much, but we are seeing cities try to figure out how they specialize. Not specialize in the way of saying, I want to jump on the nanotechnology bandwagon and have a whole nanotechnology section to bring jobs to our city, but more in a sense of what percentage of a population of people in their 50s do we have that we could see bring the kind of unique knowledge of an industry that will allow our disruptive thinkers to be able to be successful. So I certainly think you will continue to see cities specialize. Having said that, as we all very well know, most entrepreneurs pivot on the original idea, and it's an accidental pivot. I mean, often, and that pivot takes them into a different industry sector. One of Fenugream, one of the guys that we're very proud to say we helped get going. They started as a couple of guys at MIT that said, we've invented this piece of paper that we think is going to be useful in the lab. Well, to cut a long story short, they've now produced a product which is sold by Whole Foods that keeps food fresh longer for 4 or 5 days. They're now building a production factory and so forth. And they're an example of people that discovered they're in the food industry and they thought they were going to be in an entirely different kind of industry. So I think there's definitely a lack of predictability in knowing what kind of industry you're going to be serving. So,
you mentioned some countries that people told you it would never work, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or wherever else. What's happening in some of those emerging markets, or what does the entrepreneurial ecosystem look like in those sorts of places?
Yep. So either entrepreneurs are below the radar screen. So the reason entrepreneurship is really working so well in China is because the national government, and indeed the mayors, for which we're lucky because our partnership is with someone who was the mayor of Shanghai, and then she went to the national government, and we've had an 8-year relationship. So we've got a sense of how this works. And she basically made it very clear to us at the outset, if a company's not got a turnover of more than, if it's got less than $500 million a year, we don't really care about it. But over $500 million, they become a political risk, okay? Or at least they're a player. So we care about what they say, what they do, how they behave, etc. So a lot of countries you've got that where I think, what we might perceive as outsiders as being a threat to entrepreneurs is not a threat because they're kind of they don't have the time of day for them. A lot of other countries, I think there is a willingness to channel, and I think certainly we see this in the Middle East, and certainly in Iran this has been the case, to channel disruptive thinking into creative entrepreneurial behavior, but to keep it contained. So I think we've seen it flourishing because you've seen a lot of market disruption in societies that are quite conservative and traditional that would like to see that succeed. And so I think they sold themselves well in that way and frankly played the cards right. A lot of entrepreneurs specifically try to disengage from political activity for this very reason. They don't, they'd rather quietly get on with what they're doing and not become a threat. The time that it gets difficult is when you are you're starting to become a disruptive company and you're threatening a monopoly, and then the government gets involved because, should they protect the monopoly? Should they be worrying about whether or not to allow you as a collection of startups to thrive? So I certainly think that in some of those cities, there is always this danger that occurs. But generally speaking, and I'll give you one other example. So in Venezuela, they realized that how they had to really get more and more people coming into some of the shared workspaces they had started to create, they needed to get the universities on board. They had no entrepreneurship education in the universities, meaning they didn't allow the students to do things like startup weekends or boot camps or other kinds of student-driven entrepreneurial creation activities, which is really where most of the education goes on, unless you happen to be in Jeff's class. And then, but what they did was, they were very clever. They realized the only way to change the culture of the university was to get on the boards of the universities. So a lot of the guys we know who we started working with, they actually one by one started applying to get on the boards of the universities. And they would find people they knew who were old and senior and well respected, and they got them on the board of the universities. And quite frankly, they changed the policies of the universities at the university level. And the last thing I'll tell you is we're doing the same in Russia. So I do a lot of work in Russia. I'm on the board of the US-Russia Foundation, and we're there regularly. And one of the things that we're doing in Russia is, quite frankly, we've exited Moscow because we've done everything we can do, and we just need to let the clock tick away right now. But we are now working in all the other cities around Russia, and one of the ways we're doing it is that we're working with the entities that we think are protected and liked by the authorities. So for example, we're working with the universities that are funded, that are already pre-funded. They're interested in entrepreneurship, not because we just don't use words like we're there to promote democratic capitalism. No, we're there because we want to promote creating a skilled workforce that's going to be able to do value creation and create a new generation of value creation in communities and build healthy ecosystems for Russians to thrive and to create products that will be sold overseas, okay? So there's a way to package it whereby you're not a threat, and there's a way to package it whereby you're a threat. You can be political about it. You can say, I don't understand why these rules are in the place. These guys, they're like in the dark ages. So I think a lot of the time it is a question of sidestepping some of the political sensitivities, because I'm absolutely convinced that over time they will be washed away, and that entrepreneurs will be critical in that process.
So let's talk about the future. You've been doing this work for many, many years, and with the Global Entrepreneurship Week for the last several. What's the future of entrepreneurship look like around the world?
Well, certainly every single year we see more young people engage in saying, I want to either work for a startup, I know what a startup is. I think the biggest change that we will see in the future is socially active people that in the past would have said, I would never work for a big company because they exploit the poor and pollute the planet, look at a startup and say, this is my way to actually change something for good. So it's the old adage of you can do well and do good at the same time. So I think the future holds. And the reason why that's important for those of us who study entrepreneurship is because the talent pool that we're welcoming is now much more diverse. So it's not the guys that wanted to go to business school, and it's not just the girls that wanted to go to engineering school. It's now all the disciplines on campus. So you've got a lot more creative people coming into what is ultimately a creative, experimental field of innovation. So I think the future, first of all, says there's going to be more people playing in this space. I think you will see, and again, I'm happy to go on the record of this, you will see every level of government continue to clamber to figure out how they get to play in this really exciting party. They all want to be in the sandpit playing together, okay? They're like, but I wear a suit and tie and I'm boring and I don't have anything interesting to do. So tell me how I do this, okay? They want to know, we have these things called 1 Million Cups at the Coffin Foundation, which is basically a Wednesday morning coffee morning, and it's like Alcoholics Anonymous. One entrepreneur in the morning stands up, talks about all of the successes and all the warts of the struggle they're going through to create the company, and then the entire community works on it. Have you thought of this? Let's do this. I know Jack, I'll give you a call. The whole community comes together and does it. And one of the biggest challenges they have, which I know is faced at 1776, is that they do these great things which are about empowering the entrepreneurs through community engagement, but they've got all these politicians that want to show up and say, can I give this speech? So these guys are really, really keen to engage. So I certainly think in the future. And the last thing I'd say about the future is that with all the troubles in the world, I am still 100% positive on the fact, 100% clear, crystal clear, that it'll be the entrepreneurs that continue to keep the candle lit in terms of when we run into trouble. They're constantly seeing the glass half full. They're seeing how to create value out of nothing. And in fact, to come back to the point that was made earlier before we started talking, it's the entrepreneurs that will see, as you know, all entrepreneurs see, when everyone shakes things up, entrepreneurs see opportunity. They're like, oh great, all the rules changed. Everything's now on the table again, There's no longer, somebody just shook the thing up. So, if you see a more disruptive world in the future, which most of us do in many respects, entrepreneurs see that as an awesome opportunity to be able to go and do something. And I will say on that note, I'm very proud to say, so we are working this week right now with President Santos and the guerrillas in Colombia. We'll be holding our Global Entrepreneurship Congress in Medellin next March. We're awesome proud of the fact that we're using entrepreneurial programs and ventures to try to bring those sides together. We're doing the same in Cyprus, in the nomad land between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. We are doing that in, if you look at Global Entrepreneurship Week, which was 2 weeks ago, we had over 30,000 events. We had 10 million people sign up to attend those events. And you'd be amazed, there was a whole bunch of them in Syria, of all places. Who would have guessed that, okay? So I'm absolutely convinced that entrepreneurs probably are better qualified than anybody in the future anybody in the future to be able to thrive in an unstable environment, and therefore give us, I think, probably the biggest promise of being able to keep the lights on in other environments where I think we might be worried that maybe the lights will go out. So.
Excellent. I have one more question, and then I'll turn it over to our students to ask some. So for many of our students who are going to go off from school and maybe not be part of a startup right away, how can those people engage in their local startup communities? How can they stay engaged even if they want to leave their company and maybe join a startup later? They want to stay involved. How can they do that?
That's a great question. First of all, it's really, really nice that the most important thing is you're informed as to the power of value creation through new firms. And you can stay involved practically in many, many ways. The great thing, almost every community on the planet has a whole bunch of startup events. There are places like 1776 that have events every night, but even without that, there are startup weekends, there are there's all sorts of things. I mean, we've got our own collection of events, and I'll obviously be happy to plug those afterwards if anybody wants to. But the point is there are lots of events in communities that you can attend that are free of charge, that are mostly social. It allows you to keep tab on what's happening in the community. I know some of them are very oriented towards tech, but that's okay because, tech startups are the people that effectively have gone out in the jungle and cleared the path for everybody else to come in and disrupt every other industry, okay? So the point is that you should stay engaged, because as the very first time we launched Global Entrepreneurship Week, we came out and said, this is not about making everybody in the world an entrepreneur. But what we want to do is we want to reach every citizen of the world and tell them at some point in your career, it might be a fit, because either you see an opportunity or there's some pieces that come together and do that. So, and I think for most of it, it's not at the beginning of our career, as I mentioned before. The average person is much older. It's when all of a sudden you see some unique, you have some knowledge and some experience in certain industries, and then all of a sudden you see the opportunity to improve that through something. And it doesn't have to be disruptive, but it can. But of course, it should be innovative in some way that changes the way everybody does that. So part of it is staying involved, which is tracking whatever industry you're going into with a constant antenna on 24/7, which is, why do we do it this way? Does it have to be done this way? My boss tells me it has to be done this way. Our partners tell us it has to be done this way, but does it? So the best way to stay involved is keeping a constant notebook about, if you were starting a startup tomorrow, what would you change about the way your industry operates, either your company or your industry? because those are the ideas that obviously become the kernels for things that you can form a team and all of a sudden do something great with. But I would say, generally speaking, this is not complicated. It's social, it's figure out, and just go into Google browser and write startup events in Albuquerque and, they'll all come up. Start with a startup weekend. There's always a startup weekend somewhere. Show up, pay you $50 for the pizza or whatever. What do we charge at startup weekend now? Yeah, and it's like $50, something like that. $75. So, you show up at a startup weekend, stay in touch, meet those people. 3 degrees of separation, you're pretty much knowledgeable as to what's happening in your community. So,
Great.
Oh, and I'll mention one last thing. You're all welcome. So come to Medellin in March. It doesn't cost you a dime. You do have to buy your own airline ticket, but it's only about $300 or $400 if you're coming from here. And come to Medellin. It's a week. It's all 160 countries send a delegation in. Okay, so it's really cool. And so you're all welcome to come, and we'd love to have you there. So that's another way you can stay in touch with entrepreneurship if you're interested.
What are the dates?
Oh, it's March 14th through the 17th.